The year was 1941. The world was already burning. Europe stood battered under Nazi control. Britain was barely holding on across the Atlantic. The ocean had become a battlefield. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting anything that moved. Cargo ships burned one after another in the cold Atlantic night. Every sinking meant fewer supplies, fewer chances to survive. For the Allies, it wasn't just a war of bullets and bombs. It was a war of logistics, and in that war, ships were the lifeline. Every tank, every plane, every ration had to cross an ocean, but there weren't enough ships to carry them. Britain's merchant fleet was shrinking fast. The United States faced a crisis even before joining the fight. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke of an arsenal of democracy, he knew factories alone couldn't win the war. Production was meaningless if the goods couldn't reach the battlefield, so the challenge was simple and impossible. Build more ships, faster than the enemy could sink them. Build them cheap, strong, and in numbers the world had never seen. Traditional shipbuilding couldn't meet that demand. Old shipyards worked slow, with rivets and steel plates, their methods rooted in the age of sail. But war doesn't wait for tradition. A new generation of industrial thinkers rose to the challenge. Men like Henry Kaiser, a builder with no background in ship design. He had built dams and highways, but now he turned to ships, and what he proposed would change everything. Instead of building ships one by one, piece by piece, Kaiser imagined assembly line shipbuilding, sections built separately, then welded together like puzzle parts. A ship built not by sailors, but by factory workers. It was a radical idea, dismissed by many naval engineers. But America had no choice. If the Allies were to survive, innovation had to replace perfection. In late 1941, the first contracts were signed. The U.S. Maritime Commission launched a new emergency ship program. Their goal: produce hundreds of standard cargo vessels, simple, strong, replaceable. These would be the Liberty ships, not beautiful, not elegant, but built for one purpose: to deliver victory through numbers. Each Liberty ship was about 441 feet long, weighed around 7,000 tons, carried more than 10,000 tons of cargo across the ocean, and most importantly, could be built in a fraction of the usual time. As America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the program accelerated with staggering urgency. Shipyards expanded overnight. Entire new ports appeared where none had existed. From Portland to Baltimore, from Richmond to New Orleans, coastal towns became industrial hives. Steel, rivets, and sparks filled the night sky. Men and women worked around the clock, driven by the belief that every ship launched meant lives saved. At first, the learning curve was steep. Welding caused strange new problems: cracks in hulls, weak joints. But engineers adapted quickly. They redesigned sections, refined techniques, and improved safety. What once took nearly a year to build soon took only a few months, then a few weeks. The age of mass production had reached the sea. It was the dawn of industrial warfare on an unimaginable scale. Factories didn't just make bullets, they made oceans of steel. And each day, more Liberty ships rolled down the slipways. In 1942 alone, the United States launched over 500 Liberty ships. Each one carried enough cargo to sustain armies. Each one became a floating piece of America's industrial strength. But this was only the beginning. The true revolution wasn't just the ships themselves, it was the system that built them. A network of shipyards, factories, and workers that turned chaos into coordination. A synchronized heartbeat of production. Raw steel entered one end of the line, and within weeks, a ship sailed out the other. The Liberty ship became the symbol of America's industrial miracle. A ship that didn't rely on perfection, only persistence, speed, and scale. The early designs were clumsy. They weren't fast. They weren't glamorous, but they worked. And in wartime, that was all that mattered. Each vessel carried ammunition, tanks, planes, and grain, vital supplies to distant fronts. Each crossing risked torpedoes, storms, and enemy aircraft, yet they sailed anyway. The crews were often civilian volunteers. Merchant mariners, young and old, sailing unarmed through dangerous waters. They weren't soldiers, but their courage rivaled any soldier's heart. Behind every Liberty ship stood an army of unseen heroes. Steelworkers, welders, engineers, people who had never been to sea, but whose hands kept the war alive across oceans. As the Atlantic convoys formed and the Pacific routes opened, America's industrial might began to tip the scales. The enemy could destroy ships, but not as fast as America could build them. By the end of 1942, the message was clear. Ships didn't just win battles, they could win wars. And in that battle of production, the Liberty ship became the weapon no enemy could outlast. It wasn't a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of endurance, a symbol of resolve forged in steel. The arsenal of democracy was no longer an idea. It was real, it floated, and it was unstoppable. The Liberty ship was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be built, fast, cheap, replaceable. Its design came from an older British cargo vessel, the Ocean class, simple, square and sturdy. But the Americans didn't just copy it. They re-engineered it for mass production. The British had built their ships with rivets, thousands of steel rivets hammered one by one. It was slow, expensive, and labor-intensive. Henry Kaiser and his team chose welding instead. A radical idea at the time. Instead of joining plates with rivets, they melted them together with electric arcs. Welding meant fewer materials, faster joints, and less weight. But it also introduced new risks, cracks, weak seams, failures that could tear a ship apart under pressure. In the early days, Liberty ships literally split in half at sea. The steel, brittle in cold water, couldn't handle the stress. The critics called them Kaiser's coffins. But engineers didn't give up. They studied every failure, every fracture. They learned how to preheat plates, how to weld in sequence, how to test every seam, and each ship improved the next. By mid-1942, Liberty ships were rolling out faster than anyone imagined. What once took 8 months now took 8 weeks. Some shipyards aimed even higher, breaking their own records with every launch. The design itself was brutally efficient. 441 feet long, 57 feet wide, triple expansion steam engine, 2,500 horsepower, top speed 11 knots. Not fast, but unstoppable. It could carry over 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, trucks, food, munitions, anything the front needed. Everything about the Liberty ship screamed practicality. It had no luxury, no polish. Its bow was blunt, its decks plain, its living quarters cramped. But the blueprint worked because it could be repeated. Each shipyard received identical sets of blueprints, each part labeled, numbered, standardized. For the first time in history, America treated ships like factory products. Ship sections were prefabricated inland, shipped by rail to coastal yards. A hull built in one state could be joined to a deck built in another. The pieces fit together like an industrial puzzle. Kaiser's innovation wasn't about ships, it was about systems. He believed efficiency wasn't speed alone, it was coordination, a network of suppliers, workers and planners, all moving in rhythm. Across America, that rhythm began to build. Steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Ohio, propellers from California, paint and cables from New Jersey. Each component traveled hundreds of miles, only to meet its counterparts in the roaring shipyards. And when they did, another Liberty ship was born. The sight became routine. Giant hulls sliding into the water with American flags on their bows. Crowds cheering, bands playing, welders wiping sweat from their faces. Every launch felt like a small victory, a promise to those fighting overseas that help was on the way. The U.S. Maritime Commission expanded rapidly. They coordinated dozens of shipyards, each operating like a cog in a vast industrial machine. Quality control teams inspected every weld, every beam, and through this precision, output soared. In 1942, 500 Liberty ships. In 1943, more than 1,000. By 1944, production peaked. One ship every few hours somewhere in America. The process became so efficient, some shipyards started building records into their launches. The most famous, the SS Robert E. Peary. Built in just 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes, crowds couldn't believe it. Reporters called it the 4-day miracle. It symbolized what the Liberty program had become, a triumph of organization, not just engineering. But behind the headlines, there was human cost. Welders worked endless shifts, day and night. Shipyards ran under floodlights 24 hours a day. The sound of hammering never stopped. Accidents were common. Fatigue, burns, heat, frostbite. But morale remained high. Workers knew the stakes. Every delay could mean lives lost at sea. Posters hung across the yards read, "Build ships, beat Hitler." Simple words, and everyone believed them. By now, women filled entire sections of the workforce. They welded, painted, operated cranes, inspected steel. For many, it was their first job outside the home. They weren't just replacing men. They were redefining industry. In Kaiser's yards, childcare centers and health clinics appeared, making it possible for women to stay on the line. The shipyards became a social revolution disguised as a war effort. By 1943, Liberty ships had become the backbone of Allied logistics. They carried everything, from Sherman tanks to Red Cross supplies. Their grey silhouettes lined up in convoys across the Atlantic. Slow, steady, essential. Each vessel cost about $2 million, barely a fraction of a single bomber squadron. Yet it could supply entire divisions for months. The design wasn't elegant, but it was genius in its simplicity. Easy to fix, easy to replace, easy to sail. Even when damaged, most could limp home under their own power. And because so many were built, the Allies could finally replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. That was the turning point. The battle of production was shifting. The Liberty ship wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. It transformed shipbuilding forever. Before the war, constructing a ship was an art. After the Liberty program, it became an industry. Henry Kaiser once said, "You can't fight a modern war without shipping." He was right. His assembly line fleets kept the lifeblood of the war flowing. Steel bridges across the ocean. Every launch a promise, every voyage a gamble, every return a miracle. And as each grey hull disappeared over the horizon, America's factories kept the rhythm alive. Weld, launch, repeat. By the end of 1943, the program had exceeded all expectations. Tens of thousands of workers had built more ships than any nation in human history. The Liberty ship had become more than steel and steam. It was a symbol of American determination, of innovation born from necessity, of speed forged from chaos, of victory not of battleships, but of builders. By 1943, the Liberty ship was no longer an experiment. It was a phenomenon, an unstoppable rhythm of steel and labor. But the real story wasn't just about ships. It was about the people who built them. Ordinary Americans who turned factories into battlefields of production. When the men went to war, the women took their place. Mothers, daughters, widows, students. They put on overalls, gloves, and welding masks, and they stepped into the roaring furnaces of industry. The world called them Rosie the Riveter. But behind the posters and slogans were real people, facing exhaustion, heat, and danger every single day. In Kaiser's shipyards, women made up nearly a third of the workforce. They welded bulkheads, operated cranes, and inspected hulls. Their hands built the same ships that carried their sons and husbands overseas. They weren't treated as symbols. They were treated as essential. Without them, the Liberty program would have failed. And yet, the work was brutal. 12-hour shifts under rain or snow. The constant thunder of steel being cut, bent, and welded. The smell of burning metal filled every breath. But there was pride in that labor. Each spark meant progress. Each hull meant hope. A young woman named Ruth Baldwin once wrote in her diary, "I may not carry a gun, but my torch builds the ships that carry them." She was right. These workers didn't fight on the front lines, but they fought fatigue, fear, and time itself. Their weapon was the welding torch. Their battlefield, the shipyard. Kaiser understood something vital. Machines could be replaced, but morale could not. He introduced unheard-of ideas: company healthcare, childcare centers, canteens, rest areas. It wasn't just kindness. It was strategy. Healthy, motivated workers built faster and better. In Richmond, California, Kaiser's shipyards became models of modern labor efficiency. Tens of thousands clocked in daily. Every worker knew their job to the minute. Some worked the cranes high above the docks. Others crawled inside dark holes with only a torch for light. The clang of metal became a constant rhythm, a heartbeat of the arsenal of democracy. The yards themselves were cities of steel, complete with hospitals, cafeterias, bus routes, and dormitories. A nation within a nation, built for one purpose: speed. In Portland, the night sky glowed orange from molten sparks. In Baltimore, shipyard sirens marked the beginning and end of each shift. The war had turned the American coast into one continuous factory. Yet through it all, there was a sense of unity rarely seen before. People from every background, farmers, teachers, immigrants, all standing shoulder to shoulder. They were bound by one mission: to keep the convoys sailing. Each worker knew someone who had died at sea. Each new ship was personal, a tribute, a promise that no loss would be in vain, and the results spoke for themselves. By mid-1943, America's shipyards were producing at record pace. Some launched multiple ships in a single day. Flags waved, bands played, crowds cheered. For a few moments the war felt distant, until the telegrams came. The losses never stopped, but neither did the building. Welders joked that their sparks traveled faster than U-boats, and in a way, they were right. Each Liberty ship built replaced another lost to the deep. Each launch pushed the balance closer to victory. The men who commanded these ships were no less remarkable. Merchant captains, often civilians, who guided slow, unarmed vessels across deadly waters. They faced torpedoes, storms, and isolation. But their confidence rested in what the shipyards had built. They trusted the steel, the welds, the unseen hands that had shaped them, a bond between worker and sailor, forged through effort and sacrifice. Even President Roosevelt took notice. He visited shipyards, shaking hands with workers, praising the miracle of production. He understood that wars are not only fought by armies, but by those who feed and fuel them. Across the Pacific and Atlantic, Liberty ships carried everything: oil drums, jeeps, ammunition, food, each voyage a test of endurance. Sometimes only half the convoy arrived. The rest lost to submarines or storms. Yet the builders pressed on, because every ship that survived proved their work mattered. A welder in Portland once said, "I don't see ships. I see soldiers eating because of what I built." That was the heart of it all. Behind the noise and the numbers stood millions of personal stories. Some workers wrote messages inside steel plates, names, hometowns, prayers, tiny secrets sealed within the hulls. Years later, when those ships crossed oceans, those messages traveled with them, unseen, but alive. The Liberty ship wasn't just a vessel of war. It was a vessel of humanity, built by men and women who believed that work itself was a form of service. And as 1943 turned to 1944, the system they built reached full power. Shipyards worked in perfect rhythm. Every port echoed with the same sound: progress. America had mastered something the Axis never could: the union of man, woman, and machine, not through fear, but through purpose, not through force, but through belief. They weren't heroes in uniform. They were heroes in gloves, and their legacy would outlast the war itself. The world had seen the weapons of destruction, but here, in the roaring heart of industry, it witnessed the true weapon of democracy: the will to build. By 1943, the Liberty ships were everywhere. Their grey hulls dotted the Atlantic like moving cities, slow, steady, essential. But the ocean was merciless. The Atlantic was the deadliest front of all. And every voyage meant gambling with fate. German U-boats ruled the deep. They hunted in packs, waiting in silence for the sound of engines and propellers. When the convoys came, the attack began. Torpedoes streaked through the black water, explosions lighting up the night. Steel twisted. Fires raged. Men screamed. For the crews aboard Liberty ships, there was no armor, no weapons to fight back. Only courage and the hope that they'd make it to morning. Each convoy was a desperate race between survival and logistics. Every ship carried what soldiers needed to live: fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles. If those supplies didn't reach the front, the war would grind to a halt. So the Allies built a system, the convoy. Dozens of ships sailing together, protected by destroyers and aircraft when they could. But protection was never guaranteed. Fog, storms, and distance made the ocean a graveyard. Convoy after convoy left the American coast. Some made it to Britain. Some never arrived. A Liberty ship's top speed was barely 11 knots. A U-boat could go faster underwater. Every minute was a risk. Radio silence was mandatory. Lights off at night. No smoking on deck. One careless signal could draw a torpedo. The men who sailed these routes were mostly civilians. Merchant mariners. Young, brave, and often overlooked. They knew the odds. But they sailed anyway. Many had no formal training. Some were farm boys who had never seen the sea. Now they stood watching freezing winds, hands numb, eyes searching the horizon. When the alarm rang, there was no time to think, just to act. Some Liberty ships sank within minutes. Others burned for hours, lighting the sky like a funeral pyre. The sea swallowed them all. Yet still, more ships came. More steel, more courage, more determination. The builders back home didn't know the names of those lost. But they felt it. Every report of a ship gone missing meant another had to be built, and fast. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just fought with depth charges and sonar. It was fought with blueprints and rivets. For every U-boat sunk, 3 more Liberty ships were launched. And slowly, the balance began to change. The convoys learned to fight smarter. New radar systems, escort carriers, air patrols. The hunters became the hunted. By 1944, Allied convoys were reaching Europe in massive numbers. What once seemed impossible was now routine. Convoy HX-300 was the largest of all, 167 ships in formation, stretching over miles of open ocean. Each carried the lifeblood of war: fuel for tanks, food for soldiers, ammunition for invasion, and in the middle of it all, hundreds of Liberty ships, slow but steady, vulnerable but vital. Even when hit, they rarely gave up. Many damaged ships managed to limp home, their crews patching holes with wood and faith. One captain wrote in his log, "We are slow, we are tired, but we are still moving." That spirit defined the Liberty fleet. Every voyage was a test of endurance, for machines, for men, for nations. Storms often struck harder than submarines. Waves the size of buildings crashed against the decks. Cargo shifted, chains snapped. The sea showed no mercy. But through it all, the convoys kept coming. A never-ending tide of grey steel. To the Germans, it was maddening. For every ship sunk, 5 more appeared. Factories in America worked faster than torpedoes could destroy. The Liberty ship had turned the tide, not by firepower, but by persistence. The numbers told the story. More than 2,700 Liberty ships built by war's end, over 200 sunk by enemy action. Thousands more completed their journeys. Each ship carried not just cargo, but the promise of an Allied victory. When D-Day approached, it was Liberty ships that carried the supplies to Normandy: fuel, food, vehicles, everything the invasion needed. Without them, the beaches would have been empty, and the war might have dragged on for years. As the war drew toward its climax, the crews kept sailing even as the seas grew deadlier. Some ships were hit and survived. Others disappeared without a trace. their names carved later on memorial walls, their service often forgotten by history, but not by those who understood. The Liberty ship wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines or medals, but it made victory possible. The convoys were its chorus, each voyage a note in the great song of endurance. Together, they formed the heartbeat of Allied logistics, the quiet engine of victory, and though chaos ruled the ocean, order ruled the shipyards. Steel flowed in one end, hope sailed out the other. In the end, the convoys won not by force, but by resilience. Liberty ships didn't defeat the enemy in battle. They starved him, they outlasted him, they overwhelmed him. As one admiral later said, "We didn't win the war with battleships. We won it with cargo ships." The Liberty ships had earned their name, not just symbols of freedom, but its delivery vessels. By 1945, the war was ending. The guns were falling silent, and across the world's oceans, the grey silhouettes of Liberty ships drifted home. Many were scarred, rusted, or patched from battle, but they had done their duty. They had carried freedom across the sea. Factories slowed, shipyards emptied, and for the first time in years, the world exhaled. More than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, more than any other ship class in history, a number so large it redefined what industry could achieve. Not all survived. Some lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Some rested in harbours, stripped and silent, but every one of them had served a purpose. They proved a truth few believed at the start, that quantity could have a quality of its own. The Liberty ship had turned industrial speed into strategy. It made the impossible possible. It turned factories into fleets and workers into warriors. When the war ended, many Liberty ships were sold or repurposed. They carried grain, coal, refugees, and hope. They rebuilt what war had broken. In Asia, in Europe, in Africa, you could find Liberty hulls under new flags, new names painted over old scars. Some became floating schools, some became hospitals, some carried immigrants to new lives. They had been built for war, but they lived on in peace. Even decades later, long after the last torpedo was fired, you could still see them, rusting quietly in forgotten ports, steel ghosts of an industrial miracle. A few survive today, restored by volunteers and veterans. Ships like the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco and the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore. Their engines still turn. Their decks still echo with the memories of those who built and sailed them. They stand as floating museums, living proof of what ordinary people achieved under extraordinary pressure. Visitors walk their decks now, touching the same steel that once braved the Atlantic storms. The smell of oil and salt lingers, and the engine hum feels like a heartbeat from another era. The Liberty ship wasn't beautiful, it wasn't fast, but it was faithful, and it was enough. It taught the world a lesson about power, that true strength isn't in perfection, but in persistence. Nations learned from its example. Post-war industries adopted its modular design philosophy. Mass production became the new norm, in shipbuilding, in construction, in technology. The Liberty ship had reshaped not just the war, but the world that came after. Henry Kaiser returned to civilian life a legend, the man who built ships faster than they could be sunk. His methods changed how nations prepared for the future, and for the millions who worked in his yards, the memory never faded. They remembered the sound of hammers, the sparks flying through the night, the feeling of purpose that carried them through the hardest years. For them, the war was not fought with guns, but with grit, with hands that welded hope into steel. When President Roosevelt had called for an arsenal of democracy, he may not have imagined this. An army of workers, forging victory one hull at a time. They said ships win wars. They were right, but not in the way people expected. It wasn't the mighty battleships or carriers that turned the tide. It was the Liberty ships, the humble freighters that carried everything that victory required. In every ton of cargo, in every voyage completed, was the quiet power of numbers, 1,000 small efforts, multiplied beyond imagination. In the end, the Liberty ship was more than metal. It was an idea that determination could outbuild despair, that progress could outrun destruction, and that freedom could sail on steel. Even now, when historians speak of World War II, they mention the great battles, Midway, Normandy, Stalingrad. But behind them all were the convoys, and behind those convoys, the Liberty ships. Uncelebrated, unarmed, but undefeated. The Liberty ship didn't seek glory. It simply did its job, again and again, until the war was won. When the last Liberty ship left service, it carried with it the spirit of an era, a time when millions believed they could build their way to victory. And they did. Their legacy endures in every port, every shipyard, every steel vessel that followed. The design, the method, the mindset. It all began with liberty. Today their rusting remains tell the same story. That greatness can come from simplicity, that endurance can defeat destruction, that freedom once built can cross any ocean. The Liberty ship was proof that heroes don't always carry weapons. Sometimes they carry welders, sometimes they carry blueprints, sometimes they carry belief, and somewhere out there, beneath the waves or anchored in quiet harbours, those ships still rest, their hulls whispering to the sea, "We carried the world." End of episode. They said ships win wars, Liberty ships won the numbers. Total durasi, plus 25 menit format, siap TTS, CapCut voice null genre, educational widow. Documentary tone, calm, resilient, reflective.